So hello, everyone. I'm Sheila Hare from Quinnipiac University School of Law, and I'm here with my students who will introduce themselves, but it's around 12:02, and we're watching the numbers go up as people are able to get on technologically, and we'll start in a very few minutes. And there will be a boring introduction from me. I'll try to make it quick. So if you're coming in a little late, hopefully those of you who are coming in a little late won't miss anything. And actually, I just wanted to make a quick announcement before I launch into my introduction. My students are running a raffle. So if you are a QU student, please pay attention to the chat if you want to be entered into the raffle, because they will put codes into the chat at random throughout the presentation. And actually, I'm hearing it's applicable mostly to law students. So if you're a law student, pay attention so you can get raffle credit. So I just wanted to say, I'm reading this on behalf of our amazing executive chair, Kaylin Fagan, who unfortunately at the last minute couldn't come today because of a death in the family, but she really wanted to extend her warm welcome. This is the final event of the Human Trafficking Prevention Project Awareness Week. We've had a long and exciting week. And after a slew of panels and events, we hope this week has informed you about how sex reform legislation affects the human trafficking landscape. That was the panel on Monday. If you're interested in that, it was recorded. We hope that if you attended on Wednesday, we're able to hear about the lived experiences of a labor trafficking survivor of domestic servitude, and also hear from national and local advocates. If you weren't able to tune in for that one, register for the panel because we will be putting up, in all likelihood, that recording live. And we also hope that if you attended our various myths, our myths presentation, that you were informed about myths that surround human trafficking and that keep human trafficked folks from getting the resources that they need. The Introduction to Human Trafficking training, which you're now attending, is presented annually at the end of Awareness Week to give our audiences resources that will enable them to identify and safely report instances of human trafficking. So during this presentation, you will learn how our state and federal governments define human trafficking, how to spot potential signs of human trafficking, and how to safely report human trafficking to the proper authorities. And it's not a no-brainer, actually. There's a lot of, I think, gut instincts we have when faced with some of these issues that hopefully we're going to debunk, because I think people have instincts, and in fact we're going to tell you you don't necessarily follow your instincts in these situations. So we hope you will ask questions throughout the presentation in the chat box, because that is where our students can really shine. They have a wealth of knowledge on this subject, and it's really been condensed into a very small portion. And again, reading from Kaylin's script, she was really saddened she was unable to be here to educate you all today, but you're in the hands of some of our finest trainers. Simran, Brittany, London have trained scores of audiences during their time as members of HTPP, and we're confident that you'll walk away feeling that you have a better understanding about human trafficking and able to speak accurately and report suspected incidences that you see. Thank you again for attending, and thank you for your support, because we really hope that you will be part of the solution to eradicate this scourge. Okay, wonderful. So on that note, I'm Sheila Hare. I probably should have said that at the beginning. I am the faculty advisor for the Human Trafficking Prevention Project. And with that, I'm going to hand it to the students who really have made this happen. I hope everyone can see them. And I just wanted to, again, alert you, there's a chat function. Actually, there's a Q&A function, which is where we're really hoping you will put your questions. So please chime in as often as possible. And if you want, let us know who you are. If you want to put your names in the chat, we'd love to see who you are and where you're from. Wonderful. Take it away, London.
Hello, everyone. As Sheila said, this is going to be a human trafficking training project. My name is Simran. I hope we will all learn something today. You can go to the next slide. So we kind of got the overview from Sheila. We're going to talk about the basic human trafficking. What is it? How does it some ways to prevent it, some ways to identify it. And then finally, we're going to learn about some of the resources in case you suspect there's trafficking happening. But this is a good time to mention that the presentation does have a lot of sensitive images and material. So if you need to take a break, you need to step out, feel free to do so. If you need to get back into the Zoom, just let us know. You can go to the next slide. So let's start with what is human trafficking. There's a lot of misconceptions about it, which we won't get too much into, but the main definition is the willful recruitment, harboring, transportation, and provision, and obtaining of a person for a commercial sex act, labor, and it's induced by force, fraud, or coercion. That's a big part. You don't need all three of them. All three of them, I mean, would help your case, but it's not necessary. If you have just force, if you have just fraud or just coercion, that can be enough for human trafficking. So now let's get into what each of those mean. Force is the use of violence. Fraud is the use of lies. Maybe they say that there's a lucrative job in America if you come in and we'll pay you handsomely. That's a lot. And then they don't pay you anything. They lie and say you're in debt. That would be lies. And then coercion would be the use of threat. Maybe they threaten you or your family if you don't comply to their demands.
And I just wanted to add, sorry to jump in, Simran, but I think the lies really came in on our labor trafficking panel on Wednesday, because so many of the folks who end up in forced domestic servitude are told that their job will look like a certain thing. You'll be caring for the kids, you'll be able to go to school, and then they get to the United States and they find that all of that has shifted. They're working, 16 hours a day. Their passports are taken. Even the money that they were promised, they're not being paid. For safekeeping, we're going to hang on to your passport and your salary. So that's a good example that came out on Monday. Sorry to interrupt you, Simran.
No, you're totally fine. That actually reminds me, if the person is under 18, then you don't actually need all three of them for sex trafficking. With labor trafficking, I think you still need one of them. It's the same force, fraud, or coercion. Now we're going to talk about the difference between sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Sex trafficking demands for commercial sex fueled by buyers, whereas labor trafficking is demanding work from the people being trafficked, and the people who get the money are whoever is their boss. And usually they're fueled by people like you and me, because a lot of things that we take for granted might be produced by child labor or forced labor. With human trafficking, we usually hear a lot about the exploitation and selling of victims. That's usually more sex trafficking rather than labor trafficking.
Brittany, just unmute yourself. Yeah, if you want to.
I did. Thanks, Simran. So this map, I think, is a really good illustration of kind of the prevalence of trafficking within the United States. It's courtesy of the Polaris Project. And if you'll note, Connecticut is really a bright red spot on the map. And you tend to see these very high reporting areas in densely populated areas, specifically along the coasts. You'll kind of note that, there 95 runs down this whole corridor from Florida up until Maine, and you'll see that the trafficking reports of trafficking are highly concentrated in that area. There's often a lot of hotels and places that you can easily get off of the highway. There's a lot of kind of transient traffic, so you're not necessarily dealing with the same groups of people, so it's maybe a little more difficult to identify if there is someone who's being trafficked. And just something to note there, human trafficking, I think a lot of us kind of associate it with smuggling, and it doesn't necessarily have to take place across any borders to be considered human trafficking. Like Simran mentioned earlier, it has to involve the exploitation of a person via sex or work through force, fraud, or coercion. So those are the three factors that need to be present. There doesn't necessarily need to be a violation on a border, although sometimes that can also be present. It's not required. So you will note that, again, in the densely populated areas, we do tend to see more reports of trafficking. I think that's also an important point to make, is that this map is only illustrating trafficking that has been reported. You'll notice that in the middle of the country, we tend to have kind of a lack of reports coming through, and that could be attributed to a number of things. There could be fewer resources for people to report to. There's also fewer people in those areas in general. But we also know that that's the part of the country that's heavily involved in agriculture. So it's very possible that there are instances of labor trafficking taking place there and simply aren't reported. So this map is just a good illustration of where we tend to see reports, and just take away from this that it tends to happen more frequently in highly populated areas. The next slide is from the Department of Children and Families, the HEART project, or the HEART team. It's called the Human Anti-Trafficking Response Team. And this gives you a little bit of information about reports of trafficking for minors. So DCF is only tracking trafficking for people under 18. Currently in the state of Connecticut, there isn't an agency that's monitoring trafficking of adults. So all the statistics you see on this page are strictly for minors. And like Simran noted earlier, when you're dealing with a case of sex trafficking with a minor, you actually don't need to have any of the 3 force, fraud, or coercion present. They're not legally capable of giving consent, and so none of those things need to be present in order for them to be considered sex trafficked. If it's a labor trafficking, then generally, yes, you do need one of the 3 factors. But some important things to kind of that maybe jump out about this. If we look first on the left side of the screen, if we look first at the left side of the screen at the bar graph, you'll see that in the years 2002 through 2014, we see a pretty low number of reports. And this doesn't necessarily indicate that there was no trafficking taking place. DCF HEART has said that really they didn't have great reporting structures in place at that time. And then we see an uptick in reports because they're refining their report collection and they're gathering information better now. So while we do see an upward trend in the data, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't mean trafficking is increasing. It just means that we're getting better at identifying it and tracking it, and having people report it. One of the other things to observe from this is that the red bar are reports of boys who have been trafficked, and you'll see that it's significantly lower than girls. There's a number of reasons for this. Certainly, we think boys are at as much risk as anyone else, but they tend to suffer from what we would call it the lucky bastard syndrome, where the societal stereotypes around boys having sex versus girls having sex are very different. If you think about a girl who is being trafficked by someone 10 years older than them, a lot of people would have a pretty visceral reaction to that and immediately think, oh gosh, like that's seems problematic. But if you turn the tables and you have a younger boy and an older woman, a lot of the time, they get oh, you're so lucky to be with them and you're so lucky to be having sex, even when it is forced. So that could play into some of the lower reporting for boys. Turning our focus now from the bar graph to the pie chart.
And Brittany, can I just jump in there? Because
Please.
Another point really brought up in the panel on, actually, I think it was both weeks, Monday and Wednesday, was that, there also are so many fewer resources that in the state of Connecticut, literally, there are no shelters for men or LGBT folks who have been trafficked. So there's also fewer resources for them to go to, and just less awareness, I think, in terms of reporting, because people just don't see it. So just wanted to chime in with that. Thanks, Brittany.
Thank you. And I'm sorry about the dog. So if we turn our attention quickly to the pie chart, another thing to note here is that trafficking can happen to anyone. It does not matter your race, ethnicity, age. Anyone is potentially vulnerable to trafficking. Traffickers take advantage of vulnerabilities, period. And we all have vulnerabilities. But one thing to note here is that Black, Indigenous, and people of color tend to be trafficked more often, or we get reports that they are trafficked more often than white individuals. You can see that those populations make up more than half of the pie chart. Okay, thanks, London. Okay, so like I just mentioned, there's no single profile to a trafficking victim. Victims of human trafficking can be anyone, regardless of race, color, national origin, disability, religion, age, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, education level, or citizenship status. Go to the next page. Next slide, Lyndon. Thanks. And so these three slides kind of go together to drive this home, but like we mentioned, anyone can be trafficked. They take advantage of vulnerabilities. And these things that you see listed on the screen right now are risk factors that often coincide with vulnerabilities that traffickers take advantage of. So like we saw with the DCF Hart case, adolescence it is a risk factor for trafficking. There have been reports in Connecticut of young girls who meet their trafficker at high school. The trafficker tends to be very charming and gives them gifts, and they begin to develop a relationship with the girl, and that's how they bring them into trafficking. And it's kind of playing on this vulnerability that we kind of associate with teens and how they want to be accepted and they want to be included, and they want to have some type of inclusion with other people. So they're playing on that vulnerability that adolescence is typical. It typifies adolescence. Some other things that aren't listed on here, at least that come to mind for me, are things like drug use. I know that some folks who are engaging in drug use can engage in trafficking as a way to continue to get drugs. We can also see potentially immigration status as a contributing factor or a vulnerability to this. Like Sheila mentioned, people being invited into the country to have a job, but then being told that we'll keep your passport for safekeeping, we'll keep your money for safekeeping. And the individual is then really in a bad position where if they go to report it to anyone, if they have a difficult immigration status, it puts them at risk of potentially being deported, and that can be held over their head to encourage them or coerce them into staying in their role of servitude.
Can I just jump in here? I'm so sorry again, but
Please.
this is an example Kaylin would give if she were able to be here, because she's worked with some trafficking victims in the clinic. And in one of the cases, and I see this a lot, the undocumented person was told by the trafficker whom she worked for in a restaurant that if you complain in any way, I will report you to immigration, and your children are US citizens, so you will get deported and essentially you will lose your family. And when I think of that personally, I think, what would I not be willing to do if someone made that threat and I felt like it was legitimate, not knowing the system in the US or being really aware of how this works. Somebody could probably get me to do practically anything. So it can be incredibly powerful, the threats made by the trafficker, even if they're not correct or accurate, as long as the traffic person believes it, it can really be used in a very effective way to control everything they do. Sorry to jump in.
No, thank you, Sheila. Lyndon, you can go to the next slide.
Before I talk about this slide, in one of the previous webinars, I think one of the speakers mentioned that people don't traffic people, they traffic vulnerabilities. And it's really because those people reach out to you because you're in one of the vulnerable spaces that Brittany was talking about. This slide is talking about sex and labor trafficking and where it's very common. I would be interested to see if anything sticks out to any of you all. I know for me, like the casino was a big one, and also I think school is on there. I wouldn't have expected school to be there, but it is a common place. This is not every single place. It's not a complete list, but these are the most common places. You can see some overlap in places like the porn industry, where you are having sex and it could be forced or forced, but you might be getting paid for it, but you're not getting paid enough. It could be a labor issue as well. And then this is probably one of the big slides that you all were waiting for. How do you identify human trafficking? Now, again, this is not a a complete list, but these are just things that are very common: unstable living arrangements, like maybe having a lot of hotel cards, the language of the life, which is usually more familial based. Maybe they talk about dads and sisters, things like that. They might not communicate with their loved ones. Now, all of these aren't things that you might pick up on right away. You wouldn't find this in a stranger, but but even if you do, you shouldn't just assume that they're being trafficked. For example, inappropriate clothing, and this is mostly about like seasonally, maybe they're wearing something that is very revealing, but it's wintertime. That could be for many reasons, but it's just combining one or two of these, you might suspect something's happening. Actually, on the point about the inappropriate clothing, if that is something that triggers you to think that something is happening, when reporting that, you should be very careful, because if you use terms such as like they were wearing skimpy clothes, some people, it could be used against them in court. It could be like they're a prostitute or they're a stripper, but they would use it in a negative connotation. So this quote, I'll just read the quote first. Whether in private or in public, your language is important. Some people identify as victims, others survivors, or simply by their name. And this is because not everyone considers themselves a victim, or maybe they don't like the terminology of survivor. If you do meet someone, you should meet them where they're at. Maybe they haven't recognized themselves as a victim, so using their name is more appropriate. If you know them well, you can just ask them what they prefer. And then, what do trafficked persons experience now? Again, this isn't for everyone, and this one is more focused on the females, at least in terms of the unwanted pregnancies and the unsafe abortions, but some of them could be for all genders, such as the substance abuse problems. They could have it all, they could already have the substance abuse problems, or the person trafficking them could get them addicted to drugs, and that's how they keep them to keep coming back. And similar to the signs that we had before, they could have bruises and scars that might signal that they're being physically abused or they're being tortured. And there's also the malnutrition or dental problems. They might not be going to the doctors regularly, because they could tell the doctors what's going on. So they also might not be being, they might not be fed properly.
No, thank you, Simran. And I just wanted to give an example, because I think there's some discussion of gender, but in Connecticut, there was a Trumbull case, and you can look at this by Googling it online, and the conviction of the trafficker was recently overturned by the Supreme Court for slightly complicated reasons. But there was a group of men who trafficked mostly male identified victims who had various vulnerabilities. They had learning disabilities and ADHD and other kind of mental health issues. And they essentially did offer them drugs, get them addicted, offer them a home, and then began to sell them for sex. And that's right out of like some of our bedroom communities in Connecticut. In fact, the house of one of the traffickers is in just some, average neighborhood where you would least expect a trafficker to live. So Google that, and we can put that in the chat as well if you're interested. Thanks, Simran.
Of course, I just have one last note before we go on. So for sex trafficking, the quota can be up to $500 per day, and traffickers demand about $40 per act, which means that a trafficked person must endure 13 rapes per day. And as you know, even just one sexual assault can be very traumatizing. So we should keep that in mind when we're thinking about the survivors.
And then I also just want to add in that as we discussed statistics and everything like that, that trafficking can happen to anyone, and any of these experiences can happen to men, women, boys, girls, transgender persons. I just want to highlight the fact that pregnancy can occur to anyone who has a uterus. It is not specifically women. So some people find it difficult to understand why trafficked persons stay. So we're going to get a little bit into that. So traffickers basically go through a period of grooming. So the things that we value most in our life, that could be our family, that could be food, housing. A trafficked person may not have those things or may not have adequate versions of those things. So a trafficker will prey on that, give the trafficked person those things that they're looking for, that they want, that we value significantly. And then after that period of grooming, they will then break down the trafficked person, essentially make that trafficked person feel worthless and become completely isolated, completely dependent on the trafficker. And it's through this process of grooming, making a trafficked person feel that the trafficker is the only person that can provide them with all of these things, that a trauma bond forms. So this is a strong emotional connection between a trafficked person and traffickers. And this can lead the trafficked person to not recognize that they are experiencing human trafficking, that they are even experiencing abuse. They may even resist efforts at rescue because of this trauma bond and because of the strength of this. And because prior to the trafficker, they may not have had the things that they do have during their trafficking experience. So how do we break this trauma bond? As I said before, it's an extremely strong connection. So what a person has to do is essentially replace all of the things that the trafficker has provided this person. So that includes income, housing, food, and these things that we value the most, that they were able to receive from their trafficker. It's incredibly hard for adult trafficked persons to obtain these things from several social service agencies. So all of this is to say that this trafficked person may end up going back to the trafficker due to a lack of these things that they essentially need to continue their day-to-day life. I also want to point out that criminal activity can also be a reason why trafficked persons stay. The most important thing to take away from what I'm going to say is that just because a trafficked person has committed any criminal activity does not make them any less of a victim. It does not minimize their trafficking experience. So traffickers may compel trafficked persons to engage in criminal activity and then afterwards threaten them with criminal prosecution and essentially tell the trafficked person that the authorities won't believe them. So this leads the trafficked person to not trust the authorities and to feel that they can't leave due to fear of prosecution. There is also, as Simran was saying before, a quota that a trafficked person will have to reach. So the trafficked person essentially has the choice of engaging in several rapes a day in order to meet that monetary demand, engage in criminal activity such as stealing, or undergo abuse from the trafficker. And if you think about that, that's really just no choice at all. And even after a trafficked person leaves the life, they can still suffer the aftermath of a criminal conviction. And I just want to highlight that one, this makes it incredibly hard to get housing. If the trafficked person has a child, to retain custody of the child. It basically makes society traumatize them after they've already gone through their trafficking experience. Fortunately, the Quinnipiac Civil Justice Clinic did advocate for the expansion of Connecticut's vacatur statute. So vacatur essentially allows the trafficked person to set aside a criminal conviction that they had received due to them being trafficked. Fortunately, that's for, it was originally for only prostitution convictions, and that has since been expanded. There's still some work that needs to be done so that trafficked persons who have convictions that were a result of them having been trafficked are set aside so that they're able to finally move on from the experience and obtain all the things that they need to obtain just to live a life like all of us do. So what kinds of protections are available to trafficked persons? So trafficking is illegal at the federal level and at the state level in Connecticut. And the Trafficking Victims Protections Act actually does provide several rights for victims. And this includes no appropriate incarceration. So the trafficked person cannot be inappropriately incarcerated, necessary medical care and other assistance. The trafficked person should receive these things. The trafficked person should receive protection if their safety is at risk. In addition, some of these rights also extend to the families of the trafficked person. So the trafficked person and their families should be afforded protection from any intimidation and threats from the trafficker. And the identities of the trafficked person's family, as well as the trafficked person, should remain confidential. There is also other relief. So if the trafficked person is not a United States citizen, they should contact an immigration attorney because they may be eligible for immigration relief through the T visa or the U visa. So I will just briefly discuss the requirements for both of those. If you want any further information, the USCIS website is where you would go. So for a U visa, the applicant must show that they were a victim of a serious crime. This is including, but not limited to, trafficking. So this can include things such as domestic violence and strangulation and things like that. They have to show that they suffered substantial mental or physical abuse as a result of that crime. And they also have to show that they possess helpful information for the prosecution or investigation of the crime. For a T visa, this is for trafficking crimes only. So you have to show that the individual has to show that they were a victim of sex or labor trafficking, that they reasonably complied with the investigation or prosecution of the crime, and that they would suffer hardship if they were removed from the United States. So now, what do you do if you suspect someone is being trafficked? So Simran had touched upon some of the red flags. And as she had indicated, one or several of those red flags does not necessarily mean the person is being trafficked, but it does mean that maybe you take a few notes about what you're seeing, just in case. So the most important thing that you should take away from this slide is that you should not intervene. Your job as an outsider is to take notes about your observations. So you can also take a picture of this slide. We can share it in the chat as well, of what to do in each of these three situations. So the issue with intervening is that you may put yourself at risk, the trafficked person at risk, and others in the area at risk. Even doing something as low-key as taking a picture of a license plate of the trafficker's car, that can be noticed by an associate, and that will put everyone in the vicinity in danger. There's also sometimes a discussion about flight attendants noticing that someone may be a trafficked person and mouthing to them, go to the bathroom, giving them some information, especially on an airplane where there is no easy exits anywhere. That is extremely dangerous for the trafficked person, for the flight attendant, and for everyone on that flight. So your biggest step is take notes on what you see. And also be mindful of the type of terms that you use when you're describing the trafficked person. As Simran noted earlier, that using words like skimpy, promiscuous, illegal, those things can reflect poorly on the trafficked person and reflect poorly on them in court as well. And now these are some other resources that you can use to get a little bit more information about human trafficking. You'll note that there is the red mark on the blue campaign. That is only a note of caution. That is not saying that their materials are bad. They're informative. But if you are working with a traffic person who is undocumented, the Blue Campaign is part of the Department of Homeland Security's, where the immigration authorities fall under. So they may see Blue Campaign, they may see the DHS materials and be fearful that reporting what they're going through will end up having notice of their status reported, and then them and their families being deported. So when using Blue Campaign materials, those materials should be for information purposes only. You should be cautionary in putting these materials up in places publicly where undocumented persons can see them, just due to that fear of deportation and the fact that we don't want them to not report their experience because they're afraid for them and their families. And now this concludes the presentation. You'll see some contact information up on this slide. We'll also put it in the chat. I just want to thank everyone who was able to attend the training for coming, and I hope that we were able to let you know how to report human trafficking, what signs to look for, and if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or if questions come on later on, email the emails that you see up on the screen. Thank you.
And I'm hoping you guys can unmute yourselves because we have a lot of questions, and you know, folks can drop off if they need to, but oops, yeah, and we're still recording. So I think we have a couple. Let's take a couple of questions in the chat. So London, you did a great job of explaining what you do. So I am in a hotel and I suspect that there's a trafficking victim because I've seen some of the signs, right? Many of the signs, and I'm really getting suspicious. I think the instinct is to just like go up to the person and say, oh my gosh, here's the trafficking hotline number. What should I do instead? Can you just repeat why that is dangerous? I think that's our common response. That's our human nature. Why is that dangerous and what should we do instead? I just want to highlight that point that you just made.
Well, it's dangerous because especially if you physically approach the traffic person, if the trafficker notices that, which assuming that they're likely on high alert because they're in public with someone that they are trafficking, they'll notice that and they will react to that situation. So in that case, you put that traffic person that you're trying to help in danger because the trafficker likely will notice that. You put yourself in danger because now the trafficker knows who you are and what you're trying to do. And then the people within the area who will likely start looking in, trying to figure out what's going on, they will also be put in danger. So what you would do in that circumstance is if you thought that they were undergoing something super, super serious in that moment, as the slide said, that's when you would call 911. But if you just have a few observations, you're not really sure, write down those observations and you can contact the National Human Trafficking Hotline to give them some information about what's going on and some of your concerns.
Thank you so much, London. We had a couple of other questions, and I think this is really critical. And again, we had to condense our training down, but I'm wondering, somebody said, is trafficking typically reported? There must be great fear. Does anyone want to take that one? Or more than one of you?
Sure, I would say that part of the reason we're doing this training is to increase the number of people who are aware of the signs and who could potentially be reporters if they see something is happening. So again, you're not intervening, but if you do notice that you're working with someone or have a personal relationship with someone and they have maybe some of the signs, you can make a report to indicate that I've observed these things, and all of the different reports that they receive can allow them to kind of put the puzzle together to determine if this is someone that they need to maybe reach out to or provide additional services to. So even if you just notice one thing, and we know that just because it is a red flag, it doesn't necessarily, just because you observe the red flag doesn't necessarily mean the person's being trafficked. You may just observe that one thing, but the reporting agency could have received 2 or 3 other reports about the same person. So making a report, even if you're not entirely sure that they're being trafficked, can be helpful because it allows them to have a more holistic picture of what's going on.
And Brittany, can I just follow up on that? Because your slide was about the very low numbers of LGBTQI folks in the numbers, and even people identified as men and boys. And even one of your charts was like a very low number of Asians. Does that mean that there's less trafficking going on with those groups?
No, it certainly doesn't mean that. It just means that for whatever reason, and there could be multiple reasons, but they're not necessarily being reported. Some of the reasons for that could be attributed to the non-reporting are a little stereotypical, but they're kind of indicative of the culture. In Asian culture, we tend to see a little bit more of an insular focus. There's less of a discussion or a public discussion about sex. And so there might be less discussion from the trafficked person to anyone else in their life that these types of things are even going on. So some of it has to do with just a cultural norm that could contribute to the lower reporting.
I'll also just add in as well. So I talked a bit about the trauma bonding and how that can actually cause a trafficked person to not realize that they are being trafficked. I don't know. I've seen several stories of people realizing only years and years after their experience. So that's could be trauma bonding. That could be a lack of awareness and education about the signs of human trafficking, the human trafficking experience. And also for undocumented persons, that could just be a fear of information about their status getting out there and them and their families being deported.
And just to add to that, we actually heard from one survivor who said, all during the time that I was being sold for sex, I did not realize it was trafficking until I saw a presentation like 5 years after I left the trafficking situation and realized, oh my God, I think this is about me. So I think that just drove home for me the point that people don't necessarily identify as victims. They may not use the words like trafficker or trafficked person. I think a lot of folks have told us, I don't want to be called a victim. I'm not a victim. I find that kind of insulting. So again, to emphasize that people don't identify necessarily as having been trafficked, and the terminology can vary a lot, and to respect what people want to be called themselves. So. Anyone want to add something, or should I go to the next question? Great. So we got a question about, are people taken from home? Let me just see if I got the actual wording right. Are the trafficking victims taken from home, or sometimes are they left at home and still engaged?
What I will say is also, we had a Myths and Media event yesterday, and Kathleen Lima, one of our Awareness Week co-chairs, had put up a few scenarios on which was, based on a movie. So if you've seen the movie Taken, you see that, the main actor's daughter was kidnapped. So what we've seen is that's more movie based. It's honestly people that may know the trafficked person that actually traffics them. There have been situations where it is even their family members. So it's not necessarily someone coming into someone's house and removing them from their house and then trafficking them. It can be that period of grooming where they approach someone after, observing them for some time and seeing what vulnerabilities that they may possess, and then preying on those vulnerabilities to have them think it's their choice to join the trafficker.
And can you guys give an example just about some of the online stuff, especially as it plays out with young people? I know we have so many examples from Connecticut specifically, but I'm wondering if you guys could give 1 or 2 examples, because I think it's hard to imagine how can online, for example, how can you be recruited online? Why am I not being, taken? It's not taken at all. And I think the online example is a good one. Brittany, I saw you go off mute.
Yeah, so one of the examples we have is about a girl from Litchfield, and she was contacted on the internet. She went to a private school, and sorry, I just want to make sure I'm reading it correctly. She went to a private school. Her parents were allowed her to keep a laptop in her room. So she went from a rural area where where the nearest neighborhood was about a mile away, and she met someone on the internet who was from Hartford and would come and pick her up. And then she was trafficked out of Hartford, which was an area of the state that she was really unfamiliar with. So even when she was in a situation where she was able to call for help, she couldn't even really tell anyone where she was. So in that instance, the initial contact started via the internet and then led to a meetup that she went to, probably in her mind, like willingly, whether we don't know the degree of coercion that was used to get her there. But yeah, so that was an instance where the initial contact was via the internet and then met at a removed place again, right? Taking them away from a comfortable surrounding, having them rely on you because they don't know anything else in that area. And it contributed to her not being able to get help.
I've also seen examples where online they might send one of their peers or maybe an online friend an explicit picture of themselves, and the person online can almost exploit that, say, well, if you don't do XYZ, then I will reveal this picture to your parents or your family. So that's another way.
And I just want to add that a lot of information about people can be found just on the internet. So you may find a trafficker gathering information about someone based on their internet profile, and then using that to make that person think, oh, like I went to high school with them. They had the same teacher that I had. We have that connection. So it's safe to be talking to this person. So they could be using the information that's already present on the internet to make a connection and then go from there.
I think there's a real generational difference in terms of how people come to trust and come to know people online. But again, is it called is it called phishing? What is it called? Help me out, guys. What is it called? Catfishing. Yeah, where people pretend to be a certain person, they gain your trust, and then you meet at a mall, and suddenly, I think Brittany's example is like this. You find the circumstances changing, and you're just hanging out one day, and then the next day you're finding yourself in a compromised position. And a lot of it for young people is happening online. And we're worried that in COVID, the more time young people are spending online, the more susceptible they are to some of these online attempts to get them, to recruit them. Let's see, I had a couple other questions. Oh, this one's a hard one. There are two questions. You guys can take either one. What should we look for if we think someone is a trafficker? And who typically becomes a trafficker if there's a typical trafficker? These are really hard ones. And the other one that's hard, I think, is like for labor trafficking, how can we become more aware consumers of so that we're avoiding supporting this kind of these kind of industries that may rely heavily on labor trafficked services?
So what I will say about the who typically becomes a trafficker question is that anyone can become a trafficker. There really isn't no like one set profile. And if you suspect someone's being a trafficker, you don't want to walk up to them and accuse them of being a trafficker, because right then and there you put yourself in danger. And even if you had no contact with any of the people that the trafficker has been trafficking, you could still put them in danger. Maybe the trafficker thinks that someone went up to you and said something, and that's why you're approaching the trafficker. So I would indicate why you may think this person is a trafficker, and then contact the appropriate authority and explain, what you've been noticing. Because as I believe Brittany said before, a few complaints like that coming in, that can actually lead to a better investigation, a deeper investigation into this person.
And I guess one more thing, I think at least for me, when I hear about someone who's a trafficker, I immediately think that it would be a man. I don't know why. It's maybe just an internal bias, but I do. But certainly women can be traffickers. I know we were talking in clinic with Sheila earlier this week, and she was mentioning someone was hired to work as a domestic servant by a woman in the home and was forced to essentially work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so we do still see it. In labor and in sex trafficking. So even though it's maybe typical to think of a man, it certainly can be men or women.
And I hate to mention the recent case in the news, right, where there's a woman who is essentially part of the enterprise, right, that lures women in. And I think oftentimes male traffickers will work with a female trafficker, and that's the way you get the trust, because the person who's actually making the contact, the initial contact, is a woman, and you gain the trust, and then you end up in circumstances that are very different from what you were told they were. And I think that's an interesting case to look at. Yeah. Great. Anyone want to take the labor trafficking question? I'm happy to, or oh, Simran, you were going to say something. Sorry, you're off mute.
Well, I can do a general idea, and then maybe you can go more in depth. I was just going to say, kind of like with any issue, you have to do your research. I think they put in the chat the slaveryfootprint.com. If it's the same as when I used it, it's like a quiz that shows how many people, how many slaves essentially are working for you. We don't usually use the word slaves for people who are being trafficked, but that's a whole discussion in itself. But you can see like, oh, maybe the coffee that I'm drinking is rooted in child labor, or the chocolate. And then you can do more research to find maybe free trade, or even if you really want to have that chocolate, maybe you can protest or write to the people saying, I won't support you unless you stop using child labor.
And I think that is like really a great question, and it's extremely hard to answer. And we're hoping to do more presentations on, or at least one more panel on that idea, is whether we as a state or a country need to enact better, following the chain of production, because it's very difficult when you're buying the end product to know, if it's bought in a developing country, whether there is possibly trafficked labor being used. And it's very difficult to sort of develop a system whereby you can adequately assess that, and whether as a consumer there are easy websites. So again, we found with chocolate that we can get certain brands, but it's extremely difficult to do your own research as a consumer. And one of the things we were hoping to develop with the hotel industry is get, like the approval, like maybe there would be some website where folks who have done the training and have subscribed to certain standards can be part of a website where consumers can look, hey, I'm going to stay at this hotel because they have been trained and they are following certain standards. But I think it's very difficult to get that information as a consumer, and it may be something that we need more state action in terms of following the supply chain. So stay tuned. I think that's a really important issue that we're working on, and maybe we can enact some legislation in Connecticut, because California has pretty decent laws on this. Any other, oh, wow. Can a reporter be held accountable for legitimately misjudging a situation? So you're reporting it. We've gotten that question a lot from hotels. I'm afraid to report because, oh my God, what if I'm wrong? Does anyone want to take that? And I guess the other question that's asked, in case you want to take a different question, are there resources you consider to be important for parents and for youth, specifically online literacy, that we can know about and maybe refer to other folks?
What I will say is, especially with if you genuinely think that it's a trafficking situation and you take notes on your observations, calling the National Trafficking Hotline or calling DCF if it's a child, you're just telling them what you've seen. So they will investigate further into it or compare with any other complaints. Your job is to report. So I wouldn't be afraid of reporting. Yes, you may misjudge a situation. As we said, sometimes those red flags are actually red flags, and other times You know, certain types of clothing is how a person, you know, shows themselves. So it's just reporting what you see. And if it ends up being a trafficking situation, then you've helped the trafficked person. And if not, at least you reported in case.
Yeah, and I think the idea is you're not intervening. You are calling these hotline numbers, and it is their decision to intervene based on what Brittany says could be other information that you don't know about that they're putting together in order to intervene. So your job is simply providing the information. You are not causing anyone to act definitively. You are giving the information so that those resource lines that have more information than you and have the expertise and the knowledge can make an educated decision about whether to intervene. So I think that is the trick. And hopefully that will be reassuring. So we tell people, when in doubt, report. If you see something, say something, because it's not like you're going to cause the machinery to work. These are experts working on that part. Your job is just to give them in the information. That's what you're doing. Yeah, wonderful. Hey, and guys, we had a question. I don't know if you want to answer this about hospitals. What is the probability of a victim of trafficking entering a hospital or a clinic for injuries?
Yeah, I think that this nurses and medical professionals are certainly one of the areas that are at you will most likely be presented with someone who's been trafficked. Like, you're one of the areas that would be more able to identify, because they might not be coming in with an injury or something directly related to their trafficking. They might just be coming in for an annual or some other type of medical care. And then there may be signs that you notice through your care of them. Like branding or tattoos, maybe some of the language that they use to describe the people who they affiliate themselves with. In trafficking situations, they tend to use a lot of like familial language, like they might refer to their like other trafficked people as, I think, their sisters, or like some type of reference as if they're a larger family. So picking up on those things, if they're using some of those terms, but like, this really isn't their dad, like this clearly isn't their father, but they're referring to them that way. And, you know, I've seen this person and they have, you know, some type of mark somewhere on them that seems just atypical for everything else that they're presenting, or maybe scars or bruising. Different sexually transmitted diseases would also be a potential flag, like if they're consistently testing positive for some of those things. So in the medical field, certainly you're in a position to be able to notice these things, but they might not come in and specifically for these things to be addressed. It could be for something unrelated.
I also think a big thing is taking notes on these visits, because if you notice a person is coming in several times for the same thing, and you're seeing, you know, the same STDs, you're seeing, you know, pregnancy after pregnancy or things like that, while it may not necessarily mean they're being trafficked, it's definitely something to take note of, because then you can contact the National Trafficking Hotline or DCF Heart if it's a child, and relay that information that you're seeing to them.
And that's why we actually find it's really important to train hospitals, because I think a lot of statistics suggest that that is where trafficked persons interact with the outside world most commonly. We've heard that from trafficked persons that we've interacted with, like, you know, I'm not allowed to interact with the outside world without permission and in very limited circumstances. But when after my trafficker has beaten me up, or after I've had an incident where I am really, my body is about to fall apart, they will let me go to the ER room, right? Sometimes accompanied by a woman, not to raise flags, like by another person in the trafficking scheme. And those are the folks who see these persons in need of help. And so it's interesting, some hospitals have even thought of, like, you know, how do you offer the help if the individual is in the room? So one of the things we really highlight is get that person out and try to have a conversation with the person whom you suspect is being trafficked separately. But even then, that can be extremely difficult. So interestingly, someone came up with an idea of, like, if you're giving a urine sample, have like a purple dot that they can put on the bottom if they're a trafficking victim. So it says, you know, in the bathroom, hopefully, usually you're not going to see the accompanying person go into the bathroom. bathroom with the traffic person. So that's the only time they'll be alone. There's a sign on a wall saying, if you're a traffic person, here's a purple dot, put it on the bottom of the urine sample. But that's how challenging I think it can be. So we tell folks to keep their eyes for the other person, try to talk separately with this person. And I think the other challenge is being trauma informed, and really understanding that that person may not be ready to be saved at that moment, and that you just have to be patient, give them the materials, hopefully, with no one else in the room, and just hope that that will be the help that they need, that one day when they're ready, they'll have that number and they'll call. But they may not be ready in your office to just say, yes, I need to be saved, I'm a traffic victim. They may not identify as a victim, and you just have to be patient and meet the person where they're at, which can be tough when you feel like trafficking is happening. So great question from the nursing student. Yikes. What would a nurse say to a client in a hospital where if they are interacting with someone whom they think might be trafficked? And then someone said, I'd love to hear an answer for the question about training students at universities. It seems like a place where we can make a significant impact.
I think you kind of touched upon the what would a nurse say to a client in the hospital who they think might be traffic question, Sheila. Again, as Sheila was stating, you don't want to say anything, accuse them of being trafficked, especially in front of the trafficker. But I think either Simran or Brittany spoke to this point. It's about meeting them halfway. So if you suspect that you are treating a trafficked person, you don't want to come out and say, I think you're being trafficked. I would treat it like a normal medical visit, maybe ask a little more questions about the injuries and, like history of injury, something like that. So even if they don't come outright and say, I'm being trafficked, you take note of that, especially for future visits, especially if you do want to report that. And I also wanted to make this point before, when you're making those notes in the patient's medical chart, please be aware of the language that you're using. We don't want to be using words like skimpy or promiscuous or any words that could be used against the trafficked person in court or shed a negative light on them or minimize their situation.
Yeah, and to, I guess, address the how do we train students at universities, I think one of the big things I would think is raising awareness about it. It's not, at least at the universities that I've attended, it hasn't been a big focus, and it certainly could have been, and probably should have been. So making people aware that it's happening. I think, like Sheila's example earlier, that there was a trafficker whose home was in a neighborhood that you just wouldn't have thought that was the case. So making people aware of kind of the prevalence of it is a really great first step, even at a university, and making students aware of how to identify signs of it, through programming like this, honestly, through awareness campaigns. They could either be passive or active awareness campaigns. But I would say that is where I would start, at least at a university, if you don't have any ongoing attention right now.
Yeah, and I just put in the chat, these ladies will train anyone. Our trainers, we will train anyone. So just let us know. And we do adapt our trainings depending on the audience. So keep that in mind. Absolutely. Yeah, and just to that point about, I think it's challenging to know how much do these trainings help? How much does legislation help? How much does, informing yourself as a community, as a consumer help? I think we're trying all avenues. But I do think that being more aware, hopefully the message will get across. I mean, one of the things that really struck me that I was shocked by is with a labor trafficking victim on the panel on Wednesday, she said she even had a police officer and a fireman report to her home, the place where she was being trafficked. She was a young girl that was brought over at the age of 9 to take care of children in the employer's home, the trafficker's home. And she was cooking as a young child, and the fire alarm went off, and the fire fires reported, the police reported, and not once did they say, wait, you're too young to be at home cooking on a stove. You know, where are all the adults in this house? No reports made, and folks were responding to the house. And she also said that there were a ton of neighbors who saw her taking the children to the bus stop, and she was clearly too young to be the person who's like dropping them off at the bus stop, taking them park for long hours, like, hey, where are your parents? What's going on here? No one said a thing. And so that was heartbreaking. So I think at least this is one of the pieces to encouraging people to be more aware of this and maybe to sort of get involved and know the numbers that you would report to. And I'll emphasize one more thing, guys. We have a couple. Oh, I've seen mandated reporter information at the hospital where I work, but hi, Virginia, but I am not sure it's for trafficking. Interpreters should be made aware. Oh, I love this point. Victims might confide in the person with whom they share a language, right? Can I just address that? The nursing students, by the way, want a training. We're on it. Just let us know. Anybody. And we're happy to train interpreters too. But I think this is such a critical point. Medical professionals will use the person who accompanies the trafficking victim as the interpreter. And especially with labor trafficking, we see this happen over and over again. The person that they're using to interpret, the friend, is not the friend. It's the person who's there to ensure that nothing about the trafficking gets passed along to the health professional. And so I think, Virginia, you make such an excellent point, which is do not be skeptical. Do not rely on the folks that people come with as the interpreter. Use your own interpreter. Get the patient alone in a setting where you can really be sure that their accompaniment is not someone who's actually making sure that they're not answering your questions accurately. Absolutely. And I think, again, to recognize you don't want to use the word trafficked person. Are you being trafficked? I think very few of the clients that we've worked for will say, yes, I'm a trafficked person, but just asking questions in a trauma-informed way, you know, how often have you had this problem? What might be contributing to this problem? And to London's point about the legal case, we see the legal cases, and I can't tell you how many times we want the doctors to say, hey, we're a little suspicious. The victim seems frightened. You know, there are a lot of STDs here. There are a lot of really unexplained injuries. And, you know, she's reporting this, but I'm worried about domestic violence or something else that might be happening. That is a gold mine for lawyers, right? So we really want to emphasize the need for lawyers and health professionals to work together to make sure that the file is papered with stuff that we can then use. I think when we're looking for legal status and applying to immigration, they want to see medical records a lot of times. And sometimes it's just so sparse that it doesn't give a lot for us to work on. When you really paper the file with information that we can use, it is incredibly helpful. Cool. Any other questions? We're happy to stay on. We, by the way, our trainings are really incredibly interactive. You can see these students are really, really able to answer questions. It's unfortunate that we're doing it in a slightly stilted way through the chat, but when we do trainings, we do it so that we can see the audience members and that they can ask questions and we can interact, because we hope that the discussion is really the part that carries you through. Any other questions? Let's see here. Training, what would a nurse say? How can a training be set up? Contact us. Who should they contact? I wonder if we can put, we'll put in, can we put Gabrielle's information in the chat so people can contact her? Great, great. Any other things you guys want to mention? Oops, we got some more in the chat that you guys want to mention that you think we might have missed or maybe not have emphasized as much.
I think the only thing I would add is we're talking about building like the medical records with the notes, and London has emphasized that we want to be careful about the language we use because we don't want it to have negative implications in court. But I think the other consideration there is that with electronic medical records now, like I can see all of the notes that my doctor puts in my chart. So in order, a lot of the times to build rapport, like we need to make sure that whatever we're putting in the notes isn't damaging the rapport that you're building with a client that you could be seeing over a longer period of time. You might suspect early on that they could be a victim of trafficking, but they might not feel be fully comfortable confiding in you about the details of what's going on until you've established rapport. And if there are notes in their chart that are potentially, insulting in any way or make them feel like they're not comfortable talking to you, it may stilt your ability to get that information from them in the long run. So.
And the only piece that I would add, because I'm not seeing a whole lot more questions, but I think, can you guys give a couple more stories of online recruiting? I don't know if that's overdoing it, but, and if you don't have it, Brittany's looking at me like, I'm not so sure, Sheila, but I just wanted to really bring that home, how, what our concern and what we're hearing is that, folks assume that it's kids that are in a congregate care institution. London, you're nodding. I don't know if you want to pick up the thread here.
I once told Sheila a story about some people that I know who, I can't remember the name of the app, but they joined this app and essentially would be talking to this person consistently, and the person would be paying you for certain things, whether it be a conversation, a phone call, and going out to dinner. And that's just a situation where, I don't think everyone always understands the seriousness of it. And that's a situation where someone could find out your personal information, especially if you go and meet with them. You've been talking to this person for some time, you've established a relationship, regardless of payment or not. And that's how it could happen very easily. And I know that my friends would make sure if they were meeting up with this person for dinner or whatnot, they would have someone else there. So I do think that a lot of these applications that allow people to interact with essentially strangers based on a profile can lead to a lot of people confiding in someone that they may not really know. And as Sheila brought up, catfishing is a huge thing. You may think you're talking to someone your age and you may not, or you may be talking to someone completely different, and they just kind of get to know you, get to know your vulnerabilities, get to know what you want, give you that. And then that's kind of where the cycle of grooming and then breaking down could start.
Yeah, and what struck me is I was doing a training with one of our HTVP folks at a school, and we had just given London's example. This is the one that really scares me about the older person who looks online, gets your Facebook profile, sees where you go to high school, looks up the teachers and says, hey, I knew that teacher. Do you have that teacher? When I was there 5 years ago, and he was like kind of crazy. How is he now? So they develop this relationship online, right? And of course, the profile looks like a young person, kind of attractive, and you get to know each other. And then it's like, hey, let's meet at the mall, or maybe even more tricky, send me a picture of yourself. And eventually, as you gain that confidence, as Simran said, like compromising pictures get sent, and then you're really stuck because the person is threatening to show your friends and family and make it public. But as we told these stories, we were in a high school class, and one of the high schoolers said, oh, well, I recently got like something on Facebook from somebody from the University of Massachusetts asking about my like history of like scheduling and how do I do my scheduling, and because they're doing a study on high school schedules, and I'm like, and she said she responded and made them a friend, and I'm like, I think this is the example that we just told you. You have no way of knowing who that person is and whether they really are who they said. She said, I looked at the Facebook and it said University of Massachusetts, and I'm like, but anyone can create a Facebook profile like that. So you can see how these things can get started, especially with youth. And it's happening, as we tell parents, right in their homes. They don't need to be going to the mall for this to happen. It's not a taken situation. We had another story. I don't know if you guys want to mention the story about the young woman who was being trafficked from school, like from the aftercare program. Do you guys remember that one? These are Connecticut cases that DCF has told us about. Brittany's looking like, But it's interesting because the parents saw her grades dip. This is a Connecticut case. High school students saw her grades dip and were like, what do they think? Drugs, right? She says, oh, don't worry, mom and dad, I'm going to get my grades up. But I just want to be part of this aftercare. I'm going to go to this after school program. It's like high school activities. London, you want to jump in here and give the rest of the story, or shall I keep going?
I think what ended up happening was those high school activities were her trafficker picking her up from school, her being trafficked, and then being dropped back off when the aftercare activities were done with. So I know that we highlighted that it happens at schools, and that's just one of many examples.
And they didn't take attendance, right? So the family didn't know. They were like so proud of her. Her grades went up a little bit. They said she's going to this program, these after school activities. Wow, it's so awesome. And yet she was being brought back and forth from school by the trafficker.
I will also just say, I know in the chat we were asked if there were any resources about youth online literacy. I think it's very important to have a candid conversation with your children, even with people you just know, your friends and things like that, because I know that prior to coming to Quinnipiac Law, I didn't really know about human trafficking, and HCPP, this organization, was really my first experience learning more about this, and then starting to see that there are several situations, especially my use of social media, being on social media, having my personal information out there and accessible to other people that I don't know, how that could lead to a situation such as trafficking. So I think having those conversations, raising awareness within your home and within your network is extremely important.
Anyone else? And I don't know if you guys are able to see the chat, but I think we got to, we want to take one quick look before we let folks go. Is there anything you guys don't think we addressed? And I'm going to try to put that email. It's Gabrielle.Anastasio. She's head at QU. She is head of our training efforts. So just get in touch with her, or you can always email me as well. And we will absolutely be delighted to set up a training. And I dare say it'll be even more exciting than this one, because we like to do them really interactively, where we're having conversations back and forth. And hearing examples from the audience and specific questions they have. Great. What do you think? Y'all, should we sign off, or do anybody want to make any last comments? We got 37 people watching, so.
I think I don't know if each of us introduced ourselves, so maybe just a last minute introduction. I'm London Zografakis. I'm the Vice Executive Chairwoman of HCPP. I'm a 3L at Quinnipiac School of Law, and I got involved in this organization my first year, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to be training all of you and the other individuals that I have trained in the past.
I'm Brittany Eckerd. I am a trainer with HTPP. I started this year, I believe, in the fall. I'm a second-year student at Quinnipiac Law.
I'm Simran Thakur. I'm a first year at Quinnipiac Law, so this is my second semester with HTPP.
And they are like the dream team. And folks, I just wanted to say again, register for the CBF, Connecticut Bar Foundation Understanding Human Trafficking series. And you can watch the recordings of the panel this week, and also some other recordings about decriminalizing victims of trafficking. And if you're a health person, we want to really increase the discussion amongst the legal folks and the medical professionals. So be in contact. We're happy to have trainers from the medical school, the nursing school. Let us know. We'd love to collaborate. Cool. And on that note, will anyone object if I shut us down? Great. Thanks, ladies. Thanks for being such a great audience, even though we couldn't directly communicate with you. The questions were incredible, and we hope to see you at future events, because we don't stop here. Take care.